The sun burned like a merciless furnace above the endless stretch of sand dunes in the Mojave Desert. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead as she checked her watch. The training exercise was supposed to end 3 hours ago, but her radio had gone silent. She stood alone on a rocky outcrop, scanning the horizon for any sign of the extraction helicopter that should have picked up her team by now. Maria had been a Delta Force operator for 8 years. She had survived missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria that would break most soldiers, but this was different. This was supposed to be a routine survival training exercise in California, not a life-or-death situation. Yet here she was with only half a canteen of water left and no sign of rescue. The exercise had started simple enough. 5 Delta operators were dropped in different locations across a 50-mile stretch of desert. Each had basic survival gear and a radio. The mission was to reach a designated extraction point within 72 hours, using only their training and instincts. Maria had reached her checkpoint early, proving once again why she was considered one of the best operators in her unit. But something had gone wrong. Terribly wrong. Her radio crackled with static, then nothing. She had tried every frequency, every emergency channel. The silence was deafening. Maria knew that communication failures happened, but not like this. Not during a training exercise on American soil with multiple backup systems in place. She thought about her teammates scattered across the desert. Jake Morrison, the unit's explosives expert, had been dropped 30 miles east. Tom Bradley, their medic, was somewhere to the north. Sarah Chen, their tech specialist, was positioned south of her location, and Marcus Williams, their sniper, had been placed the farthest west. All of them were experienced operators who could handle themselves in hostile territory, but the desert was unforgiving to everyone. Maria made a decision. She would head toward the original extraction point, even though it was 20 miles away. If the helicopters were still coming, that's where they would go first. If not, at least she would be moving toward civilization instead of sitting still and slowly dying of thirst. She packed her gear methodically. 1 canteen with maybe 6 hours of water left, a knife, a small first aid kit, some energy bars that would only make her more thirsty, a compass and map, and her sidearm with 2 magazines. Not much to survive in one of the world's most dangerous deserts. As she began walking, Maria's mind drifted to her childhood in Texas. Her father had been a Marine, and he had taught her about survival from a young age. He always said that the desert was like a living thing that tested everyone who entered it. Those who respected it and understood its rules might survive. Those who didn't would become another statistic. The sand beneath her boots was already hot even though it was still morning. By afternoon, the temperature would reach over 120 degrees. She had maybe 8 hours of walking time before the heat became deadly. Then she would need to find shelter and wait for the cooler evening hours. Maria had survived worse conditions during her deployment in Syria. She remembered a mission where her team had been trapped in the desert for 4 days with minimal water, but they had been together then, watching each other's backs and sharing resources. Now she was alone. After 2 hours of walking, she spotted something that made her blood run cold. In the distance, she could see the wreckage of a helicopter. Black smoke was still rising from the crash site. Maria's heart pounded as she changed direction and ran toward the wreckage, her boots sliding in the loose sand. When she reached the crash site, her worst fears were confirmed. It was a military helicopter, but not one of the extraction birds she had been expecting. This was a search and rescue helicopter, and from the looks of the wreckage, it had been down for at least a day. The metal was twisted and burned, and there were no signs of survivors. Maria searched the area carefully, looking for any clues about what had happened. She found pieces of radio equipment scattered in the sand, all of it destroyed beyond repair. In the pilot's compartment, she discovered something that made her stomach drop. A mission brief with her name on it, along with the names of her 4 teammates. The document revealed that this helicopter had been dispatched to extract the Delta operators after their training exercise had been cut short due to a security concern, but someone or something had brought down the rescue bird before it could reach them. This was no longer a training exercise. This was a real emergency, and Maria was beginning to understand that she and her teammates might have been deliberately stranded in the desert. But why, and by whom? She found a small survival pack in the wreckage that had somehow escaped the fire. Inside was a water purification kit, some medical supplies, and a flare gun with 3 flares. It wasn't much, but it could mean the difference between life and death. As Maria prepared to leave the crash site, she heard something that made her freeze. In the distance, she could hear the sound of vehicles approaching. Multiple engines moving fast across the desert floor. She grabbed her binoculars and climbed to higher ground for a better view. What she saw made her blood run cold. 3 black SUVs were racing across the desert, kicking up clouds of dust. These weren't military or rescue vehicles. They looked like the kind of unmarked cars used by intelligence agencies or private military contractors. And they were heading straight for the crash site. Maria had seconds to make a decision. She could stay and try to signal for help, hoping these were friendly forces. Or she could assume the worst and disappear into the rocks and sand dunes before they spotted her. Her training kicked in, and she chose survival over hope. She grabbed the survival pack from the helicopter and moved quickly into a maze of rocks about 200 yards from the crash site. From her hiding spot, she watched as the 3 vehicles surrounded the wreckage. 6 men in tactical gear emerged from the SUVs. They moved with military precision, but something about them seemed wrong. They weren't wearing any identifying patches or uniforms. Maria watched as the men searched through the helicopter wreckage. One of them was talking into a radio, but she was too far away to hear what he was saying. After about 10 minutes, they climbed back into their vehicles and drove away, heading in the direction Maria had been walking. She waited another hour before moving, making sure they were really gone. When she finally emerged from her hiding spot, Maria knew with absolute certainty that she was in serious trouble. This wasn't a failed training exercise or a simple equipment malfunction. Someone wanted her and her teammates dead, and they were willing to use the desert as their weapon. The sun was now directly overhead, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Maria needed to find shelter and figure out her next move. She was a Delta operator, trained to survive against impossible odds. But she had never faced an enemy like this one, an enemy that could make people disappear in the vast emptiness of the desert without leaving a trace. Maria found shelter in a small cave formed by fallen rocks about 3 miles from the helicopter crash site. The temperature had climbed to 115 degrees, and even in the shade, the heat was overwhelming. She rationed herself to small sips of water every hour, knowing that dehydration would kill her faster than whoever was hunting her. As she waited for the sun to move lower in the sky, Maria tried to piece together what was happening. The Delta Force training exercise had been planned for months. Only a handful of people knew the exact locations where each operator would be dropped. This meant that whoever was behind this had access to classified military information. She thought about the mission brief she had found in the crashed helicopter. It had mentioned a security concern that prompted the early extraction. But what kind of security concern would require pulling 5 of the military's most elite operators out of a routine training exercise? And why would someone want to eliminate them in the process? Maria's radio suddenly crackled to life. She grabbed it quickly, hoping to hear a friendly voice. Instead, she heard something that made her heart race. "Santos, we know you're out there." The voice was calm and professional, with no accent she could identify. "We have your teammates. If you want to see them alive, you need to come to coordinates 34.7749, 115, 11372. You have until sunset." The radio went silent. Maria stared at the device, her mind racing. They had her teammates. Jake, Tom, Sarah, and Marcus were all in enemy hands. But how had they been captured so quickly? And who were these people? She pulled out her map and found the coordinates. They were about 15 miles northwest of her current position, in an area marked as an old mining operation. It would take her at least 6 hours to reach on foot, assuming she could maintain a good pace in the desert heat. Maria knew it was a trap. Everything about this situation screamed ambush. But she also knew that leaving her teammates to die wasn't an option. These people had chosen to target Delta operators for a reason, and that reason probably involved extracting information or eliminating witnesses to something bigger. She decided to move immediately, even though the heat was still dangerous. Every minute she waited was another minute her teammates might be suffering or worse. Maria packed her gear and began the long trek across the desert, using rock formations and sand dunes to stay hidden from anyone watching the area. After 2 hours of walking, she spotted movement in the distance. Maria dropped to the ground and crawled to the top of a small ridge for a better view. Below her, she could see a convoy of vehicles stopped at what looked like a temporary camp. Through her binoculars, she counted at least 12 people in military-style clothing. But what caught her attention was a large white tent set up in the center of the camp. Outside the tent, she could see 4 figures sitting on the ground with their hands tied behind their backs. Even from a distance, she recognized them immediately. Her teammates were alive, but they were clearly prisoners. Maria studied the camp layout carefully. The kidnappers had chosen their position well. The camp was in a natural depression surrounded by low hills, making it difficult to approach without being seen. Guards were posted at regular intervals around the perimeter, and she could see at least 2 vehicles positioned to provide covering fire if needed. She noticed something else that troubled her. These weren't amateurs or random criminals. The way they had positioned their camp, the discipline of their sentries, and their equipment all suggested military or intelligence training. Whoever these people were, they knew exactly what they were doing. As Maria watched, a man in khaki clothing emerged from the white tent. He walked over to where her teammates were sitting and began talking to them. She was too far away to hear what was being said, but she could see that the man was questioning each of them individually. The radio in her pack crackled again. "Santos, we can see you watching us. You have 1 hour to reach the camp, or we start eliminating your friends one by one. Come alone and unarmed." Maria cursed under her breath. They had spotted her despite her careful approach. These people had thermal imaging equipment or other advanced surveillance gear. She was dealing with professionals who had been planning this operation for a long time. She keyed her radio. "What do you want?" "We want to talk. About the mission in Syria 6 months ago. About what you and your team discovered there." Syria. Maria's blood ran cold as she remembered that mission. Operation Desert Shield had been classified at the highest levels. Her team had been sent to extract a high-value target from a compound near the Turkish border. But when they arrived, they found much more than they had bargained for. The target they were supposed to extract was already dead. In his place, they had discovered evidence of a massive arms-dealing operation that involved several high-ranking officials from multiple countries. The intelligence they gathered had the potential to expose corruption and illegal weapons sales that reached into the highest levels of government. Maria and her team had completed their mission and turned over all the evidence to their superiors. They had assumed the information would be used to shut down the weapons operation and prosecute those involved. But now it seemed like someone had decided that the witnesses needed to be eliminated instead. "We turned over everything we found," Maria said into the radio. "We followed proper channels." "Not everything," the voice replied. "We know your team kept copies of certain documents. Insurance policies, you might call them. We need those documents, and we need to ensure that no one talks about what you discovered." Maria understood now. Someone in the chain of command was involved in the weapons operation her team had uncovered. They couldn't risk having Delta operators walking around with knowledge that could destroy careers and send people to prison, so they had devised a plan to eliminate the problem permanently. The training exercise had been the perfect cover. 5 operators die in a desert accident during routine training. No one would ask too many questions, especially if the bodies were never found. The desert would hide the evidence forever, but their plan had gone wrong when Maria escaped the initial trap. Now they were trying to salvage the operation by using her teammates as bait to draw her in. Maria made her decision. She would go to the camp, but not in the way they expected. These people had made a fatal mistake. They had threatened her team, and they had underestimated what a Delta operator was capable of when pushed into a corner. She began moving toward the camp, but instead of taking the direct route they expected, she circled around to approach from the east. The sun was starting to set, which would give her the advantage of having the light behind her when she made her move. As she got closer to the camp, Maria could hear voices more clearly. Her teammates were being interrogated about the Syria mission and the location of backup files they supposedly had hidden. She heard Jake's voice, strong and defiant, even though he was clearly under duress. "We don't have any files," Jake was saying. "We turned everything over to command. That's how this works." The interrogator's voice was cold and professional. "Your teammate Santos is very resourceful. She made it farther than we expected, but she'll be here soon and then we can finish this business." Maria checked her watch. She had 30 minutes until the deadline they had given her. 30 minutes to figure out how to rescue 4 of the military's best operators from a well-defended position, with nothing but her sidearm and the element of surprise. In the distance, she could hear the sound of helicopter rotors approaching the camp. Whatever these people were planning, they were preparing to move soon. If she was going to act, it had to be now. Maria Santos had never backed down from a fight in her life. She wasn't about to start now, even if the odds were impossible. Her teammates were counting on her, and she would rather die trying to save them than live knowing she had abandoned them to save herself. The desert had tested many people over the years. Tonight it would test them all. Maria moved like a shadow across the desert floor, using every piece of cover available as she approached the enemy camp. The setting sun cast long shadows between the rocks and cacti, giving her the concealment she needed. She had 20 minutes left before their deadline, but she wasn't planning to walk into their trap. From her new position on the eastern ridge, she could see the entire camp layout. Her teammates were still tied up near the white tent, but now she could see armed guards positioned much closer to them. The helicopter she had heard was a black military-style aircraft, sitting about 200 yards from the main camp, its rotors slowly spinning as if ready for immediate takeoff. Maria counted 15 hostiles in total, too many for a direct assault, even for a Delta operator. She needed to be smart about this. The key was creating enough chaos and confusion to give her teammates a chance to help themselves once she freed them. She pulled out the flare gun she had recovered from the crashed helicopter. 3 flares. Not much of an arsenal, but flares could be more than just signals in the right situation. They burned at over 2,000 degrees and could start fires or temporarily blind anyone looking directly at them. Maria loaded the first flare and aimed it at the fuel tanks she could see near the parked vehicles. If she could create an explosion or fire, it would draw most of the guards away from her teammates and give her the distraction she needed. She squeezed the trigger. The flare arced through the desert air and struck one of the SUVs directly in the gas tank. The explosion was immediate and spectacular, sending flames and smoke high into the evening sky. Shouts erupted from the camp as guards ran toward the burning vehicles, but Maria was already moving. She had seconds before they realized the attack was coming from the eastern ridge. She sprinted down the slope toward the white tent, her pistol ready. The camp was in chaos, with men shouting orders and running in different directions. She reached the tent just as one of the guards turned to check on the prisoners. Maria's knife found his throat before he could raise his weapon or sound an alarm. She quickly cut the ropes binding her teammates' hands. "About time you showed up," Jake whispered as he rubbed feeling back into his wrists. "We were starting to think you'd decided to leave us here." "Never," Maria replied, handing him the dead guard's rifle. "What's the situation?" 15 hostiles, maybe more," Sarah Chen said quietly as she picked up the guard's radio. "They've been asking about Syria and some files they think we have. Their leader is a guy named Morrison, says he's CIA, but I don't buy it." "Where is he now?" Maria asked as she loaded her second flare. "In the command vehicle, the one that didn't blow up." Tom Bradley pointed toward an armored truck parked away from the burning cars. "Maria, these aren't just mercenaries. They know too much about our operations, about classified missions. Someone high up is feeding them information." Before Maria could respond, automatic gunfire erupted around them. The enemy had figured out where the attack was coming from and was closing in on their position. Maria fired her second flare directly at a group of 3 guards approaching from the north. The burning projectile struck one of them in the chest and his scream scattered the others. "Move," Maria shouted.
"Head for those rocks on the south side."
Her team moved with the precision that came from years of training together. Even after hours of captivity and interrogation, they functioned as a unit. Marcus Williams grabbed a rifle from another fallen guard, while Tom Bradley secured additional ammunition. They reached the rocky outcropping just as more gunfire erupted behind them. The enemy was regrouping, but they had lost the advantage of having hostages to control the situation. "Santos," the voice came from a loudspeaker attached to the command vehicle. "You've only made this worse for yourselves. We have helicopters coming with reinforcements. You're trapped in the middle of nowhere with limited ammunition and no backup coming." Maria keyed the radio she had taken from the first guard. "Morrison, is it? Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back in your vehicles and leave. If you don't, none of you are leaving this desert alive." Laughter came through the speaker. "You're in no position to make threats, Sergeant. You're outnumbered 3 to 1, and we have thermal imaging equipment that can track your every move. This ends one way or another." As if to emphasize his point, Morrison's voice continued. "You see, your team stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple arms-dealing operation in Syria. The weapons you discovered were part of a carefully planned operation, to arm resistance groups in 3 different countries, groups that are fighting against regimes we need removed. That's illegal under international law, Sarah called out from behind a boulder. Laws are flexible when national security is involved, Morrison replied. Your team's interference cost us months of planning and millions of dollars in lost opportunities. More importantly, you have evidence that could expose the entire program and the people who authorized it. Maria understood the full scope of what they were facing now. This wasn't just about covering up illegal weapons sales. This was about a black operations program that probably involved the highest levels of government. People had decided that 5 Delta operators were expendable if it meant protecting a multi-billion-dollar covert operation. We don't have any evidence, Jake shouted. We turned everything over to command. Not everything, Morrison's voice replied. We know that Delta teams are trained to keep insurance files on sensitive missions. Dead man switches, you call them. Files that get released automatically if something happens to the team members. Maria exchanged glances with her teammates. Morrison wasn't entirely wrong. After some of the missions they had been on, they had developed a system of keeping backup evidence as protection against being sacrificed by their own government. But those files were hidden in places that would take years to find, and they were encrypted in ways that would make them useless to anyone else. The sound of approaching helicopters was getting louder. Morrison hadn't been bluffing about reinforcements. Maria counted at least 2 aircraft, maybe 3, coming from the north. In a few minutes, they would be facing overwhelming odds. We need to move, Marcus said, checking his rifle. This position won't hold against helicopter gunships. Maria looked around at the terrain. They were in a natural bowl surrounded by low hills. Great for defending against ground attack, but terrible if the enemy had air support. They needed to reach higher ground where helicopters would have trouble maneuvering. There, she pointed to a mesa about a mile to the south. If we can reach that high ground, we can defend it until help arrives. What help? Tom asked. For all we know, our own command structure is compromised. Morrison might be right about this going all the way to the top. Maria pulled out her last flare and checked the direction of the wind. The helicopters were almost overhead now, their searchlights beginning to sweep the area below. Then we make our own help, she said. Sarah, can you use that radio to contact anyone outside of normal military channels? Sarah nodded. I can try to reach some contacts in other agencies. FBI, NSA, maybe even foreign intelligence services if this is as big as Morrison claims. The first helicopter appeared over the ridge, its searchlight cutting through the gathering darkness. Maria could see armed men preparing to rappel down ropes onto their position. Time to go, she said, firing her last flare directly at the helicopter's cockpit. The pilot banked hard to avoid the burning projectile, buying them a few precious seconds. The 5 Delta operators ran across the open desert toward the distant mesa, with 3 helicopters and a dozen ground forces pursuing them. The odds were impossible, but Maria Santos had never been one to give up easily. If they wanted to silence her team, they were going to have to work for it. Behind them, Morrison's voice echoed across the desert through the helicopter's loudspeaker. You can run, but you can't hide forever. The desert will kill you if we don't. Maria smiled grimly as she ran. Morrison had made one crucial mistake. He thought the desert was his ally in this fight. But Maria had been born and raised in places like this. The desert wasn't her enemy. It was her home. The run across open desert was the longest mile of Maria's life. Behind them, 3 helicopters swept the area with searchlights while ground teams and vehicles raced to cut off their escape routes. The mesa ahead looked impossibly far away, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. Contact left, Marcus called out as muzzle flashes erupted from a sand dune 300 yards away. The sniper and Marcus dropped to one knee and returned fire with precise 3-round bursts, forcing the enemy team to take cover. Maria's team spread out into a defensive formation as they moved, each operator covering a different field of fire. Years of training together had made them instinctive in how they moved and fought as a unit. Even exhausted and outnumbered, they were still one of the most effective fighting forces in the world. A helicopter gunship swooped low overhead, its machine gun chattering as bullets kicked up sand all around them. Sarah dove behind a large cactus and immediately began working on the radio she had taken from the camp. I'm getting something, she called out over the noise of rotor blades and gunfire. There's a frequency that's not being jammed. Someone's trying to reach us. Before she could say more, the helicopter made another pass. This time Jake was ready for it. The explosive expert had found some grenades on the guard he had taken down, and he waited until the aircraft was directly overhead before pulling the pin and throwing. The grenade exploded just behind the helicopter's tail rotor. The aircraft spun wildly and crashed into the desert floor 200 yards away, sending up a huge cloud of dust and debris. "One down, 2 to go. Nice throw," Tom shouted as he provided covering fire for the team's continued advance. "I always was good at baseball," Jake replied, already preparing another grenade. They reached the base of the mesa just as the ground teams closed in from 3 directions. The rocky slope ahead was steep and would leave them exposed, but it was their only option. Maria led the way, climbing quickly from boulder to boulder while her teammates provided covering fire below. Halfway up the cliff face, Sarah finally made contact with the outside world. "This is Delta Team 7 to any station. We are under attack by unknown hostiles in the Mojave Desert. Request immediate assistance." The response came immediately. "Delta 7, this is Agent Rebecca Martinez, FBI Counterintelligence. We've been tracking unusual military aircraft in your area. What's your situation?" Maria grabbed the radio. "Agent Martinez, we have been targeted for elimination by what appears to be a rogue CIA operation. They claim we have evidence from a classified mission that could expose illegal weapons operations." "Copy that. We've been investigating similar reports from other agencies. Can you hold your position for 30 minutes? We have assets moving to your location." "Negative on 30 minutes, Maria replied as bullets sparked off the rocks around her. "We're under heavy fire and running low on ammunition." Below them, Morrison's remaining forces had set up a perimeter around the base of the mesa. The 2 remaining helicopters circled overhead like vultures, occasionally diving down to strafe their position. Maria's team had reached a natural shelf about 100 feet up the cliff face, but they were essentially trapped. "Santos," Morrison's voice echoed off the rock walls. "This is your last chance. Come down and we'll make this quick and painless for you and your team." Maria looked at her teammates. They were all down to their last magazines, and the enemy showed no signs of backing off. But there was something in their eyes that Morrison couldn't understand. These weren't soldiers who had ever surrendered, and they weren't about to start now. "You want us?" Maria called back. "Come and get us." What happened next became the stuff of legend in military circles. Morrison's ground teams began climbing the cliff face from multiple directions, thinking they had the 5 Delta operators cornered and helpless. They were wrong on both counts. Marcus Williams, the team sniper, had found a position where he could cover most of the cliff face with his rifle. His first shot took down the lead climber on the eastern approach. His second shot disabled the searchlight on one of the helicopters, sending it spinning away into the darkness. Jake Morrison had saved his last 2 grenades for this moment. He waited until the enemy climbers were bunched together on the narrow ledges below, then dropped both grenades with perfect timing. The explosions echoed through the desert like thunder, and suddenly the cliff face was much quieter. Tom Bradley, the team medic, had found something interesting in his medical kit. Morphine syringes could be used for more than just pain relief. He began preparing several syringes with doses that would put a man unconscious in seconds. If anyone made it to their position, they would get a very unpleasant surprise. Sarah Chen had continued working with the radio, and she had managed to establish contact with multiple outside agencies. The FBI, NSA, and even some foreign intelligence services were all suddenly very interested in what was happening in the Mojave Desert. But it was Maria who made the move that changed everything. While her teammates held the defensive position, she found a way to climb higher up the cliff face. The mesa had a flat top that would give her a commanding view of the entire battle area. When she reached the top, Maria discovered something that made her smile for the first time in hours. An old mining operation had left behind some very useful equipment, including several crates of industrial explosives that had been abandoned when the mine closed. The mining explosives were old and probably unstable, but Maria had learned enough from Jake over the years to know how to use them safely. She began setting charges at strategic points around the top of the mesa, creating a trap that would collapse part of the cliff face if triggered. Meanwhile, the radio chatter was revealing the true scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered. Agent Martinez was coordinating with multiple agencies, and it was becoming clear that the weapons operation Maria's team had discovered in Syria was just the tip of the iceberg. "Santos, we've got confirmation on your intel. Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. The Syria operation was part of a program called Desert Thunder that's been running for 3 years. Multiple government officials are involved, including some at the Pentagon. Who authorized the hit on my team? Maria asked as she finished placing the last explosive charge. We're still working on that, but the order came from very high up. High enough that even CIA Director Morrison might be a patsy in this. Someone wanted your team eliminated before you could testify about what you found. Morrison. Now Maria understood. The man calling himself Morrison down below probably wasn't even CIA. He was most likely a private contractor hired to clean up the mess that Desert Thunder had become. A new voice came over the radio. Delta 7, this is Colonel James Hartford. Pentagon Intelligence. Hold your position. We have a Marine recon team inbound to your location. ETA 15 minutes. Maria keyed the radio. Understood, Colonel. But I don't think Morrison is planning to wait 15 minutes. As if summoned by her words, both remaining helicopters suddenly rose above the mesa top, their machine guns aimed directly at her position. Maria dove for cover behind the mining equipment just as bullets began tearing through the air where she had been standing. But the helicopters had made a fatal mistake. By rising above the cliff face, they had put themselves directly in the blast radius of the explosives Maria had placed around the mesa top. She waited until both aircraft were hovering over the charges, then triggered the detonator Jake had helped her build from spare radio parts. The explosion was spectacular. Tons of rock and debris erupted into the night sky, engulfing both helicopters in a cloud of dust and stone. The aircraft disappeared into the darkness, their engines silent. Down below, Morrison's remaining ground forces suddenly found themselves facing a new problem. The explosion had started a landslide that was rushing down the cliff face toward their position. They abandoned their assault and ran for their vehicles, but several didn't make it to safety in time. In the sudden quiet that followed, Maria could hear the sound of approaching helicopters from the east. But these had different engine sounds, and Sarah confirmed through the radio that they were the Marine rescue team. Santos. Morrison's voice came weakly through the radio. He was apparently one of the survivors from the landslide. This isn't over. You've seen too much, and there are too many people involved to let this go. Maria picked up the radio and smiled. Morrison, whoever you really are, you made one big mistake tonight. What's that? You assumed the desert was on your side. But some of us know how to make the desert fight for us instead. The sound of Marine helicopters was getting louder, and in the distance Maria could see the lights of ground vehicles approaching from multiple directions. The cavalry was finally arriving, but she and her team had held their own until help could reach them. As she climbed down to rejoin her teammates, Maria realized that this night was far from over. They had survived the immediate threat, but the conspiracy behind Desert Thunder was still out there. And now that they had proven they couldn't be eliminated quietly, things were about to get much more complicated. The Marine rescue helicopters touched down in a swirl of dust and rotor wash, disgorging a full squad of heavily armed Marines who quickly secured the area. Maria and her team were extracted to a forward operating base that had been hastily established 20 miles from the battle site. But instead of the medical attention and debriefing she expected, Maria found herself in a windowless room facing a panel of officials she didn't recognize. Agent Martinez was there, along with Colonel Hartford and several others in civilian clothes who introduced themselves only by first names. Sergeant Santos, Colonel Hartford began, what happened tonight has created a significant problem for national security. The Desert Thunder operation you uncovered has tentacles reaching into multiple government agencies and allied nations. A woman named Director Susan Caldwell, who appeared to be leading the panel, leaned forward. We need to know exactly what evidence your team collected during the Syria mission, and more importantly, we need to know what copies exist and where they're located. Maria studied the faces around the table. These people weren't asking for information to prosecute the guilty parties. They were asking so they could control the damage and protect the operation. Before I answer any questions, Maria said carefully, I want to know who authorized the attempt to eliminate my team tonight. That's classified, Caldwell replied. What matters now is containing the situation and preventing sensitive information from falling into the wrong hands. Sarah Chen, who was sitting beside Maria, spoke up. With respect, ma'am, someone just tried to murder 5 American soldiers to cover up illegal weapons operations. I think we have a right to know who was behind it. Agent Martinez cleared her throat. The investigation is ongoing, but we have reason to believe the elimination order came from someone with access to the highest levels of classified information. Someone who knew about your team's capabilities and your standard operating procedures. Maria felt a chill run down her spine. You're saying it was someone inside our own command structure? We're saying it's possible, Colonel Hartford replied, which is why this debriefing is being conducted by a joint task force from multiple agencies. We can't trust normal channels until we know how deep this goes. Director Caldwell opened a thick file folder. The Desert Thunder operation began 3 years ago as a legitimate intelligence program. The goal was to provide weapons and training to resistance groups fighting against regimes that pose threats to American interests. But somewhere along the line, it became something else entirely. She slid several photographs across the table. Maria recognized some of the weapons from the Syria compound, but there were others she had never seen before. Advanced systems that looked like they belonged to the American military, not resistance fighters in foreign countries. These weapons weren't just being sold to freedom fighters, Agent Martinez explained. They were being sold to anyone willing to pay, including groups that are actively hostile to the United States. The operation became a massive black market arms dealing scheme disguised as legitimate intelligence work. Tom Bradley, the team medic, leaned forward to examine the photos. How much money are we talking about? Conservative estimates put it at over $2 billion, Caldwell replied. Money that was supposed to be funding legitimate covert operations was instead lining the pockets of corrupt officials and their private contractor friends. Jake Morrison whistled softly. $2 billion is enough motive to kill a lot of people. Exactly, Colonel Hartford said. Which is why your team became a target. The evidence you collected in Syria could expose the entire network and send dozens of high-ranking officials to prison for treason. Maria looked around at her teammates. They had all been thinking the same thing since the attack began. Someone they trusted, someone in their own chain of command, had marked them for death. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Marcus Williams asked. Because if it's just the documents we turned over to command, those have probably been destroyed or altered by now. Director Caldwell smiled grimly. That's where things get interesting. We've been investigating Desert Thunder for months, but we never had direct evidence of the weapons transfers. The documents your team recovered filled in crucial gaps in our investigation. But those documents went through normal channels, Sarah pointed out. If the conspiracy goes as high as you're suggesting, then that evidence is compromised. Not all of it, Agent Martinez said. Your team's standard operating procedures include creating backup files for sensitive missions. Files that are hidden and encrypted according to protocols that even your commanding officers don't know about. Maria exchanged glances with her teammates. The backup files were real, but they were protected by systems that would take years to crack without the proper access codes. The question was whether these officials could be trusted with that information. Before we discuss any backup files, Maria said, I want to know what happened to the man who called himself Morrison, the one who led the attack tonight. Colonel Hartford consulted his notes. Morrison's real name was David Chen, a former CIA operative who went private 5 years ago. His company, Desert Solutions, has been providing security services for several classified operations. He survived the landslide but died from his injuries during medical evacuation. Convenient, Jake muttered. Chen's death actually created a problem for us, Director Caldwell continued. He was our best lead for identifying the people at the top of the Desert Thunder hierarchy. His phone records and financial accounts have been scrubbed clean. Maria was beginning to understand the real reason for this meeting. These officials needed the backup files not just to prosecute the guilty parties, but to identify who else was involved in the conspiracy. Without that information, they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see. Sergeant Santos, Agent Martinez said, we know that Delta teams maintain what you call insurance policies on sensitive missions, dead man switches that activate if something happens to the team members. We need access to those files. And if we refuse? Sarah asked. The room fell silent. Director Caldwell's expression didn't change, but Maria could sense the tension rising around the table. You're not prisoners, Colonel Hartford said finally, but you're also not free to leave until this situation is resolved. Too many people have died tonight and too many national security interests are at stake. Maria understood the unspoken threat. They were being given a choice between cooperation and indefinite detention. But there was something else going on here, something that didn't quite add up. You said you've been investigating Desert Thunder for months, Maria said to Agent Martinez. How did you know to track aircraft in our area tonight? How did you know to send help exactly when we needed it? Agent Martinez hesitated before answering. We had intelligence suggesting that elimination teams were being deployed against personnel who had knowledge of the operation. Your team was on a watch list. A watch list? Tom asked. You knew we were targets and you didn't warn us? The training exercise was supposed to be a safe environment, Colonel Hartford replied. We thought the security measures would be sufficient. Maria felt anger rising in her chest. You used us as bait. You let them attack us so you could identify the people behind Desert Thunder. That's not entirely accurate, Director Caldwell said. But we did hope that any elimination attempt would reveal the scope and methods of the conspiracy. Jake stood up abruptly. So you're telling us that our own government put us in danger to catch some corrupt officials? People died tonight. Good Marines died trying to rescue us from a situation you could have prevented. The greater good sometimes requires difficult choices, Caldwell replied coldly. That was the moment Maria realized they were still in danger. These officials weren't trying to protect her team or bring justice to the guilty parties. They were trying to control the situation for their own purposes, just like the people behind Desert Thunder. I need to consult with my team, Maria said, standing up. Privately. Of course, Agent Martinez replied. But don't take too long. There are other forces at work here, and time isn't on our side. As they were escorted to a small conference room, Maria caught Sarah's eye and made a subtle hand signal. Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly. They all understood. The real fight was just beginning, and they still didn't know who they could trust. Outside the conference room, Maria could hear helicopters landing and taking off, vehicles arriving and departing. The forward operating base was a hive of activity, but she had no idea whether all that activity was meant to protect them or eliminate them. One thing was certain. The desert had tested them tonight, and they had passed. But the test wasn't over yet. Someone out there still wanted them dead, and now they knew that even their rescuers might not be on their side. Maria looked at her teammates and saw her own determination reflected in their faces. They had survived the desert, survived the attack, and survived the initial interrogation. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The backup files were their only leverage in this game, and Maria intended to use that leverage wisely. But first, she needed to figure out who was playing for which side in a conspiracy that seemed to grow larger and more dangerous with every passing hour. In the privacy of the small conference room, Maria's team huddled together and spoke in whispers. Years of operating in hostile territory had taught them to communicate without being overheard, even when they appeared to be having a normal conversation. Something's not right, Sarah whispered while pretending to review documents. Agent Martinez knew too much about our backup procedures. That information is classified above her clearance level. Jake nodded while appearing to stretch his shoulders. And did you notice how quickly they had a forward operating base set up? This wasn't a rescue operation. This was planned. Marcus, always the most paranoid member of the team, had been studying the room since they entered. 3 cameras, 2 microphones that I can see. Probably more hidden ones. They're watching and listening to everything. Tom was examining a water bottle, turning it in his hands as if checking for contamination. The medical officer who looked at us wasn't military. Private contractor based on his equipment and procedures, same type that Morrison was using. Maria processed this information while maintaining a calm expression for the cameras. Their rescuers weren't just investigating Desert Thunder. They were part of it, or at least connected to it in ways that made them untrustworthy. We need to assume that everyone in this facility is compromised, she said quietly. The question is whether we try to escape or play along until we can figure out who the real enemy is. Before anyone could answer, the door opened and Agent Martinez entered with 2 guards. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we've received some troubling intelligence. There are reports of additional elimination teams moving toward this area. Maria stood up. What kind of teams? Private military contractors similar to the ones you encountered tonight. Our sources suggest they're being sent to clean up any loose ends from the failed operation. Colonel Hartford appeared in the doorway behind Martinez. We're evacuating this facility immediately. Your team will be transported to a secure location where you can complete your debriefing in safety. Where? Sarah asked. A classified facility in Nevada. Full security. Complete isolation until we can neutralize the threat against you. Maria didn't like the sound of that. Complete isolation usually meant complete control, and she was beginning to suspect that these officials had their own agenda for her team. "Colonel," she said, "we appreciate the protection, but we'd prefer to handle our own security. My team has safe houses and contacts that aren't connected to any government agencies." "I'm afraid that's not an option," Director Caldwell said, entering the room with several more officials. "The threat level is too high and there are too many unknowns. You'll be safer in federal custody." The word custody confirmed Maria's suspicions. They weren't being protected. They were being detained, just like Morrison had detained them in the desert. The only difference was that this prison had better air conditioning. "What if we refuse?" Jake asked. "Then you'll be detained as material witnesses in a federal investigation," Caldwell replied. "Either way, you're coming with us." Outside the conference room, Maria could hear the sound of helicopters spooling up for departure. Multiple aircraft, which suggested a large operation. Too large for a simple protective evacuation. Sarah caught Maria's attention and pointed subtly toward the window. Through the glass, she could see armed personnel moving around the base in a very specific pattern. Not the random movement of soldiers providing security, but the coordinated positioning of troops preparing for an operation. Maria made a decision. "We'll need a few minutes to gather our personal equipment." "Of course," Agent Martinez said. "But please hurry. We want to be airborne in 10 minutes. As soon as the officials left the room, Maria's team sprang into action. They had maybe 5 minutes before someone came back to collect them, and they needed to use that time wisely. Sarah immediately went to work on the room's communication system. Her technical skills allowed her to tap into the base's radio network and monitor the chatter between different units. "They're not talking about protecting us," she whispered urgently. "They're talking about package containment and asset denial. Those are termination protocols." Jake was examining the window and door frames, looking for the best escape route. "This room is on the second floor, but there's a drainage pipe outside that could get us to ground level. Problem is, we'd be completely exposed crossing the compound." Marcus had found something interesting in his examination of their guards' equipment. "The weapons these people are carrying aren't standard military issue. They're the same type we saw Morrison's team using. High-end private contractor gear." Tom was monitoring the corridor outside their door. "Movement in the hallway. Looks like they're positioning guards at all the exits. We're being contained, not protected." Maria looked at her teammates and saw the same realization in all their eyes. The rescue had been a trap, just like the original training exercise. Someone wanted her team isolated and under control, and they had used multiple layers of deception to achieve it. "The backup files," she said quietly. "That's what this is really about. They need those files to identify everyone involved in Desert Thunder. But they also need to make sure we can't testify about what we know. So they're planning to extract the information and then eliminate us," Sarah concluded. "Probably make it look like the private contractors got to us despite their best efforts," Jake added. "Clean up the loose ends and claim they tried to protect us." A new voice came through Sarah's improvised radio tap. "Phase 1 complete. Targets are contained and ready for transport to Site 7. Interrogation team is standing by." Site 7. Maria had heard that designation before during classified briefings. It was a black site facility where high-value targets were taken for enhanced interrogation. People who went to Site 7 rarely came back, and when they did, they were usually broken beyond repair. "We have maybe 2 minutes before they come back," Maria said. "Options?" "Window," Jake said immediately. "It's our only chance." "We'll be sitting ducks in the compound," Marcus pointed out. "Better than being sitting ducks in a federal black site," Tom replied. Maria made the call. "Window. Sarah, can you create a distraction with the radio system?" "Give me 30 seconds, Sarah said, her fingers flying over the communication equipment she had access to. Jake was already working on the window, using tools from his kit to quietly remove the frame's locking mechanism. The window opened onto a narrow ledge that ran along the building's second floor. "Got it?" Sarah whispered. "I'm broadcasting a false alarm about incoming aircraft from the east. That should draw most of the security away from this side of the building." Almost immediately, they could hear soldiers running toward the eastern perimeter of the compound. Sarah's diversion was working, but they had maybe 60 seconds before someone figured out it was a false alarm. "Go," Maria ordered. Jake went first, sliding out the window and onto the ledge. Marcus followed, then Tom. Sarah was next, but she hesitated at the window. Maria, I'm picking up radio chatter about a backup plan. If we escape, they're planning to blame our deaths on the same private contractors who attacked us tonight. They'll claim we were killed during a second assault on the base. All the more reason to get out of here alive, Maria replied, pushing Sarah toward the window. As Sarah climbed out, Maria could hear footsteps in the corridor outside their door. Someone was coming back earlier than expected. She grabbed the radio equipment Sarah had been using and followed her teammates onto the ledge. The drainage pipe Jake had identified was about 10 feet away, but reaching it would require jumping across a gap with a 50-foot drop below. In the darkness, it was impossible to see exactly what was waiting for them at the bottom. Santos, Agent Martinez's voice called from inside the room they had just evacuated. Where are you? Maria looked at her teammates crouched on the narrow ledge. They had survived the desert, survived Morrison's attack, and survived the interrogation. Now they were about to attempt an escape that could either save their lives or end them. Together, she whispered. Together, Jake confirmed. They jumped into the darkness, not knowing what waited below, but knowing that whatever it was had to be better than the fate that waited for them in federal custody. Behind them, alarms began sounding throughout the compound as their escape was discovered. The desert had tested them again, and once again, they had chosen to fight rather than surrender. But the test was far from over, and Maria knew that the most dangerous part of their ordeal was still ahead of them. Maria and her team landed hard in a drainage ditch behind the compound's main building. The impact knocked the wind out of all of them, but no one was seriously injured. They had maybe 30 seconds before search teams would be deployed to find them. Move, Maria whispered, and they began crawling through the drainage system that ran beneath the base. The concrete tunnels were cramped and filled with stagnant water, but they provided cover from the infrared cameras and thermal imaging equipment that would soon be scanning the area. Behind them, they could hear shouting and the sound of vehicles starting up. Searchlights swept across the compound as security teams realized their prisoners had escaped. But Maria's team was already 200 yards away, moving through the underground drainage network toward the perimeter fence. There, Tom pointed toward a grate that led to the outside of the compound. Beyond it, they could see the open desert stretching toward distant mountains. Jake used his tools to remove the grate quietly, and one by one, they squeezed through the opening into the desert night. They were free of the compound, but they were also alone in hostile territory with no transportation, limited supplies, and an unknown number of enemies hunting them. We need to put distance between us and the base, Maria said. They'll have helicopters in the air within minutes. But as they started moving toward the distant mountains, Sarah held up her hand for silence. She was still carrying the radio equipment she had taken from the base, and she was picking up communications between the search teams. They're not just looking for us, she whispered. They're coordinating with someone else. Someone called Control who's giving them our probable escape routes. Maria felt her blood run cold. Control had access to detailed intelligence about Delta Force escape and evasion procedures. That meant someone very high in the military command structure was involved in the conspiracy. How high does this go? Marcus asked, voicing what they were all thinking. Before anyone could answer, they heard the sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. Multiple aircraft moving fast and low. The search was beginning in earnest. We need to split up, Maria decided. 5 people moving together are too easy to track. We'll rendezvous at the backup location in 72 hours. The backup location was a safe house that Maria's team had established years earlier, completely off the books. It was their emergency fallback position if everything else went wrong. And everything had definitely gone wrong. Maria, Sarah said, before we split up, you need to know what I heard on the radio. They're not just trying to capture us. They're planning to stage our deaths and blame it on Morrison's people. As far as the world will know, we died heroes fighting off a terrorist attack, which means they can bury the whole Desert Thunder investigation along with us, Jake realized. Not if we get to those backup files first, Maria replied. Sarah, can you reach the files from outside normal channels? Maybe, but I'll need access to secure communication equipment and at least 12 hours without interruption. The helicopter sounds were getting closer. Maria made quick decisions about their separation. Sarah, you head north toward the highway. Find a way to contact our external allies and access the files. Tom, you go with her for medical support. Jake and Marcus, you take the western route toward the mountains. I'll go south and try to draw their attention away from the rest of you. No, Jake said immediately. We don't split up. We've survived this long by staying together. We'll survive longer if they can't track all of us at once, Maria replied. This is the only way to ensure that at least some of us make it out alive. Tom handed Maria a small medical kit. Antibiotics and pain medication. You'll need them. Marcus gave her one of his backup knives. Carbon fiber blade. Won't show up on metal detectors if you need to go through security. Sarah pressed a small device into Maria's hand. Emergency transponder. One-time use only. If you're about to be captured, activate it. It'll send your location to every intelligence agency in the world. Jake didn't say anything.
He just grabbed Maria in a quick embrace that said everything words couldn't express. 72 hours, Maria said.
Safe House Alpha. If someone doesn't make it, the others continue the mission. They separated into the darkness just as the first helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight cutting through the desert air like a sword. Maria headed south, moving quickly but carefully across the rocky terrain. For the next 6 hours, she played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the search teams. She would show herself just long enough to draw their attention, then disappear into the landscape before they could close in. She led them away from her teammates' escape routes, sacrificing her own safety to give them time to reach cover. As dawn broke over the desert, Maria found herself alone on a ridge overlooking a small town called Baker. She was exhausted, dehydrated, and running on pure determination, but she was alive, and as far as she could tell, she had successfully drawn the search away from her team. Her radio crackled with an encrypted message from Sarah. Package secure. Meeting location confirmed. 72 hours. Relief flooded through Maria. Her teammates had made it to safety and were working on accessing the backup files. Now she needed to survive long enough to reach the rendezvous point. But as she prepared to move toward the town below, Maria heard something that made her freeze. Vehicle engines, approaching fast from multiple directions. She had been found. 3 black SUVs raced up the dirt road toward her position, kicking up clouds of dust. Maria could see armed figures inside, and she recognized the tactical gear. These weren't federal agents or military personnel. These were private contractors, the same type that Morrison had used. Maria had 2 choices: run and risk being hunted down in the open, or make a stand on ground of her choosing. She chose to fight. The ridge she was on had good defensive positions and clear fields of fire. More importantly, it overlooked the main highway where any gunfight would be visible to civilian traffic. These contractors preferred to work in the shadows, and publicity was their enemy. As the SUVs reached the base of the ridge, Maria opened fire with her sidearm. Her first shots took out the lead vehicle's tires, sending it skidding off the road. The contractors immediately took cover and began returning fire, but they were shooting uphill at a well-protected target. The gunfight lasted 20 minutes. Maria used every round of ammunition she had, making each shot count. When her pistol was empty, she switched to the knife Marcus had given her and prepared for close combat. But before the contractors could reach her position, something unexpected happened. State police vehicles arrived on the scene, responding to reports of gunfire near the highway. The contractors found themselves caught between Maria's position and law enforcement. In the confusion that followed, Maria managed to slip away from the ridge and make her way toward the town. Behind her, she could hear the contractors trying to explain to the state police why they had been conducting a firefight in the desert. 3 days later, Maria reached the safe house. Her teammates were already there, and Sarah had successfully accessed the backup files. What they found was even worse than they had suspected. Desert Thunder wasn't just about illegal arms sales. It was about creating a private army of contractors who could operate outside of congressional oversight and constitutional restrictions. The money from weapon sales was being used to fund a shadow military force that answered only to a small group of officials who believed they knew better than elected leaders. "We have everything," Sarah said, showing Maria terabytes of data, financial records, communications, operational plans, enough evidence to bring down everyone involved. "Including the people who tried to eliminate us?" Maria asked. "Especially them," Tom replied. "We know who gave the orders, who funded the operation, and who covered it up afterward." Jake was monitoring news broadcasts on a laptop. They're reporting that 5 Delta Force operators died heroically defending a classified facility from terrorist attack. There's going to be a memorial service next week. Not if we have anything to say about it, Maria said grimly. Marcus had been studying maps and transportation schedules. We can get this information to multiple news organizations simultaneously. Once it's public, they can't cover it up or eliminate us. Maria looked at her teammates, these people who had followed her into hell and back. They had been tested by the desert, by their enemies, and by their own government. They had survived because they trusted each other more than they trusted anyone else. Then let's go public, she said. It's time to show the world what Desert Thunder really was. 2 weeks later, the story broke simultaneously in newspapers across the world. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Dozens of officials were arrested, including the director who had tried to interrogate Maria's team at the forward operating base. The Desert Thunder conspiracy collapsed like a house of cards once the truth was revealed. The private military company that had attacked them was disbanded, and new oversight procedures were put in place to prevent similar operations. Maria Santos and her team received commendations for their service and their courage in exposing the corruption. But more importantly, they had proven that even when surrounded by enemies and abandoned by their own government, Delta operators never surrender. The desert had tested them, and they had passed every test. They had been left thirsting in the hostile wilderness, hunted by professional killers and betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect them. But they had learned something that their enemies never understood. Delta operators don't run from death. They face it head-on, together, and they find a way to survive. The conspiracy was over, but Maria knew there would always be other threats, other tests. That was the nature of their work and their world. But whatever came next, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through the Mojave Desert, because some people are tested by adversity and broken, others are tested by adversity and forged into something stronger than steel. Maria Santos and her team had been forged by the desert, and they would never be the same again.